Let's hear about outdoor pickleball construction from Oliver Benzine. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, so I'm going to introduce that.
Oh, please.
Okay, so one of the big roles for the Board of Park Recreation Commissioners is to consider new park uses. In our system, park uses need to be adopted via the park board, and changes of use to existing facilities need to be adopted through a process here. So what you are doing right now is preparing you for some future decisions on choices we will present to you to make. But this is the process for that. One of the things that we get is sort of the public demand for pickleball. I went over and introduced myself to the folks who are here from the pickleball community and shared with them that I played pickleball as a kid. I love pickleball. I'd be playing pickleball now if I wasn't working, right? So pickleball is kind of a big deal and it's fun. And tonight we're having a continuing conversation on what the pickleball opportunities look like. Oliver Bazinet has done a survey, and what he would like to do here this evening is report out on that survey. We put funding in the Park District for pickleball. So I think with all due, deference to the folks who are here, we are equally excited about some future opportunity to expand pickleball, and that is reflected in our Park District budget. So with that, I'll turn it over to Oliver.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Excellent, and see my screen?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent, thank you. Good evening. My name is Oliver Bazinet. I'm a senior planner in the Planning, Development, and Maintenance Division at Seattle Parks and Recreation, and the project lead on the 2021-2022 Outdoor Pickleball Study, which I'll be briefing you on today. I'm going to kind of give you a brief overview as I kind of get into the presentation. We're going to start with some background, talk about kind of pickleball's explosion and what we've done to date, fill you in on the scope of kind of this recent study. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the themes that we have heard in our engagement. And then the meat of this is really going to be discussing the approaches we've identified for expanding pickleball capacity, and kind of the process that we're planning to kind of continue with. So at the end, I'm going to talk about next steps and where that leads us to, because this study is really kind of the beginning of a broader community conversation about expanding pickleball. As you may know, pickleball was invented in 1965 rather, on Bainbridge Island. And if you've opened a newspaper or magazine in the past 6 months, you've probably come across at least one article about how it's been rapidly, getting more and more popular. Most of them quote this source that's shown on the right, which is the Sports Fitness Industry Association. As you can see, pickleball participation has been steadily increasing over many years, but really saw a big jump in the past few years. As of 2020, the SFIA estimated that over 4 million Americans are playing each year. And if you've been out to a location where there are pickleball courts, you've probably seen that this is definitely true around here, which is part of the reason it's our new state sport. Its popularity, I think, has been attributed to a bunch of factors that you've already kind of heard about a little bit tonight. First, it's relatively easy to pick up compared to a lot of other sports that have a steeper learning curve at first. I've heard a lot of people say that it just takes a couple sessions to learn, but a lifetime to master. I think the other factor is really its social nature. So locations with lots of courts kind of almost organically become like these large drop-in sessions where people can count on showing up and being able to rotate through. It's often played in doubles, and people will play 15 or 25-minute games with different folks. This gives it the potential to become very inclusive and draw people to courts that they know are popular, right, where they know they can get a game. So, the photo on the left here came from Green Lake on a nice evening this summer, and you can kind of see all the paddles stacked up as folks are waiting to kind of rotate in and play. At Seattle Parks and Recreation, we had very few courts until 2017. At 5, I guess, is what the slide says. So that's when we started implementing a pilot program to add pickleball striping to existing tennis courts. We also, around that time, started having a lot more regular conversations with the Seattle Metro Pickleball Association. They did a large evaluation themselves in 2018 to look at potential locations for dedicated courts, which I'll talk a bit more about later on. And then in 2019, we published a report at the conclusion of the pilot that recommended retaining the existing dual stripe sites and then identifying criteria and making recommendations to expand to new courts in each district. So since that time, we've continued to add the number of courts that are dual striped and a few dedicated or close to dedicated courts. So now we're at about a total of 77 courts, or we are at a total of 77 courts. At the end of this summer, we will be at 89 courts. So that kind of gets us to our current study, and the goal of that is really to take the next step in future pickleball court planning, design, and development. So the goal of this work was really to do a few things. We wanted to build off the 2019 pilot study recommendations, and document the growth of pickleball and kind of see where we are at compared to other cities. We wanted to refine our kind of court selection, which sites and how we do the dual striping of tennis courts, and have kind of a broader conversation about that. And then we also wanted to identify and recommend potential locations for dedicated outdoor pickleball courts. So we evaluated 16 different sites across the city, or had our consultants evaluate these sites. And then to give us a sense of what a site might include and cost, they also developed concepts for 2 of these sites. As part of all this, we really wanted to engage with the pickleball and tennis community. You may be asking why the tennis community, and a lot of the reason is because, as I mentioned, our strategy has largely focused on doing this dual striping, and so that also affects tennis players as well, because they're also using these courts. We did one-on-one interviews with a number of stakeholders. We convened an advisory committee that had 9 meetings, and we had a couple folks that played tennis on the advisory committee. We had a couple folks that were kind of pickleball only players, and then I think we had 3 members that played both pickleball and tennis, as well as a couple staff from Seattle Parks and Recreation that are kind of more heavily involved in programming these sites. We also did an online survey, which I'll be going through some of the results of as well, and we got over 3,000 responses, which kind of knocked us off our chairs. We also held 2 public online open houses. So I'll kind of be talking about what the content of those open houses are as I kind of get through the next parts of the presentation. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about community engagement, and really mostly in respect to the survey responses. As I mentioned, we got over 3,000 responses to this survey, and I'll add the caveat that we published it far and wide on social media and our website and through a number of different listservs, but it's a qualitative engagement tool as opposed to statistically representative. We did get a lot of respondents that played pickleball, and a lot of respondents that played tennis, and as you can see, there's a lot of overlap between these communities. One thing that we heard loud and clear is that pickleball players are generally dissatisfied with both the quality and quantity of pickleball courts in Seattle. So, I think this is something that I want to make sure that they hear that we've heard them. The other thing to note is that tennis players are also generally dissatisfied with the quality and quantity of tennis courts in Seattle. So I know there can be often a grass is greener mentality a little bit when it comes to these dual use facilities. So this is something that we also kind of have to respect as we do planning for pickleball and tennis going forward. We heard pretty consistently, similar kind of facilities and features of dedicated or pickleball courts in general were kind of emphasized by a lot of our different respondents. And, I won't necessarily go through all of these, but I'll say that these really kind of helped inform our evaluations as we started looking at the particular approaches and the specific sites that would be good candidates for them. The other kind of interesting result that we got from the survey was that people seemed, there wasn't necessarily a clear overriding answer on whether people preferred, a large dedicated hub for pickleball or kind of having distributed dual stripe courts across the city, right? I mean, I think a lot of people value the idea of having a court close to their homes, but then a lot of other people are really interested in having those, large drop-in locations that they might be willing to, to go a little bit further for. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the approaches themselves. And I'm going to start with kind of a broad overview of the different approaches that we considered as part of the study, as well as some of the main criteria and considerations that we included. So you can kind of see the approaches on the left, and then a lot of the guiding considerations on the right. And I'll get into more detail about each of these approaches. But I guess what I want to say here is that both were established based on the interviews, advice from the advisory committee, responses to the survey, and then input from that first public open house. And then on the right, you can also see a map of all of our existing outdoor pickleball courts, be they multi-use or dedicated, and the size of the little bubble indicates the number of courts at each of those locations. And so first, I'm going to talk a little bit about dual striping, which is also called blended lines. This approach is probably the most familiar to many of us. It's like adding pickleball lines to some neighborhood and community tennis courts throughout the city. So, one of the guidelines that we're kind of working with right now is that we wouldn't add these lines to courts where there are USTA tournaments like Amy Yee or Lower Woodland. Our current standard is to add 2 pickleball courts per tennis court, as shown. And then users or we will supply the portable nets or the Douglas or semi-permanent nets that you can see in the image on the right. And these are kind of heavier nets that can be rolled onto the court when pickleball is being played and then rolled off. But they're a little too heavy to easily walk away. One of the advantages to, kind of going with this approach of dual striping is that it increases the number of pickleball courts pretty quickly. We're adding 16, more pickleball courts this summer, and it's relatively inexpensive. One of the drawbacks, of course, is that it decreases the availability of these courts for tennis, and then dual striping, can add just more lines to the courts in general. It can also increase the probability of on-court conflict from noise or if people have reservations and that sort of thing. So ideally, we would do this with a resurfacing of the court because the lines tend to be more visible in that case. And it's also tends to, it also becomes a win for the tennis players as it increases the quality of the courts. But we've also, in order to add quick capacity, we have added lines. And, I think in the past we haven't always added the nets, but we're going to be doing that a lot more, partially because of the, feedback that we've gotten in the course of this study. So this is kind of the immediate term strategy. The other approach identified during the course of the study was also conversion of some of our existing tennis courts to pickleball. So the advantages of this is that it increases the number of pickleball courts by a slightly greater density. So because they'll be pickleball only, it allows for a higher density of co-located courts. You don't have to worry about, distracting asymmetrical overlays or overlap of run-out zones between tennis and pickleball courts. What we've kind of found is that candidates that provide the best value may actually be the single courts, and those that we recommended to change, especially are those that are actually already in the incorrect orientation. I don't know if you know, like tennis players and pickleball players like to have their courts in a north-south orientation so that the sun isn't in their eyes. And so we have a few tennis courts that are single courts that are east-west, and you can kind of convert them to 4 pickleball courts that are oriented the right way, as you kind of see on the right. The drawback, for this obviously is that it decreases the number of tennis courts. And so we've made some recommendations, as I mentioned, to consider limited locations for this, as those sites would be resurfaced or renovated in the future. And our approach to that would really be to do some local engagement before we do that, to make sure that that's what the communities around them want. This is kind of a more top-down approach, and before we make a change that drastic, we would want to do some engagement more locally. So this is kind of a more medium-term strategy as we would work through these the resurfacing or renovation projects at these courts. And then, I'm going to talk a little bit about process here for both of those two strategies, both of those two approaches, because they both kind of start from existing tennis courts. So the way we kind of identified our recommendations for these sites was really by listing out, all of the criteria that we identified, as important for each of the existing tennis courts, and then looking at a map of the current distribution of pickleball courts to establish recommendations that filled geographic gaps in certain types of courts. And then we also factored in site-specific information like accessibility and proximity to residences, and to make recommendations that provide options with, say, lights across the city. So these recommendations were brought to the second public online open house, where we had breakout sessions for the 5 different regions of the city to review and get feedback on the recommendations, for those particular areas. And this provided a lot of helpful insights that are informing the immediate implementation, as well as prioritization for work going forward. And those maps of each of those different areas and the particular recommendations for each of those sites can all be found on our project website if you're interested in looking at it in more detail. For dedicated facilities, because we're not starting with existing tennis courts, our process was a little bit different. This is probably the most popular approach, but also, the most expensive. Is the creation of dedicated pickleball facilities of a significant size that can serve as citywide hubs for play. So where people can count on being able to show up without an opponent and rotate in or play with friends. And ideally, these sites would be lit and include some social amenities like gathering spaces and associated furnishings. So, the advantages are obviously that it really increases the number of pickleball courts in one shot and better co-located too. And then there's no negative impact to tennis. But, the drawbacks are, it potentially, where they're located, it could potentially reduce open space that exists elsewhere. It's certainly, probably the most expensive of the options we're looking at. may take a little longer to implement. And then, we'll have to think about like the site constraints and the budget constraints at each location for, whether we would be able to provide things like lighting or some of the other amenities that we mentioned. And from a process standpoint, this one is a little bit different from the other two because it doesn't begin with existing tennis facilities. So instead, we had a long list of potential candidate locations that Seattle Metro Pickleball Association had identified in a 2018 effort. To that list, we looked across our system and talked to a lot of our staff and looked for potential locations and identified a lot more sites until we had a list of about 50. And then we ultimately narrowed that down to about 16 locations that our consultant, D.A. Hogan, conducted site assessments at to provide recommendations on suitability. So our goal was to identify top candidates in the north and the south. And you can see the distribution of those sites on the map here. They're also on the maps on our project website. Based on the site assessments, the feedback that we gathered from our advisory committee and the feedback that we received during the second online open house and from staff, the sites that look most promising are shown here. We have the Magnuson Park E3 parking lot, which is the parking lot just north of 65th as you come into Magnuson. There is a project that SPU is going to be doing to reduce the size of the Bitter Lake Reservoir that will likely provide some open space there. And then in the south, Genesee Park, the open space just east of Rainier Community Center, Georgetown Playfield, and then the T-ball field at Hiawatha Playfield, which is kind of in the southeast corner. Were all sites that looked pretty promising for most of the criteria we identified. None of them are perfect, but again, they had these certain strengths that touched on these criteria. But there's a few things that I also want to note about these options. The first is that this effort, so far has not included local engagement with kind of the non-pickleball tennis community. We had a lot of great input in our public open houses from pickleball and tennis players, but I think before we make a final recommendation or site decision, we need to start doing that engagement more locally. So while I feel that confident in saying that some of these sites might serve pickleball pretty well, we also need to start the engagement to confirm that pickleball will also work for these communities. The second thing that I want to mention and make sure that we say is we had some serious learnings regarding cost. We asked our consultants to do a planning level costing exercise based on looking at the Magnuson E3 parking lot and Genesee Park examples, using a set of required and desired site elements to give us a sense of what we might be looking at in terms of cost for developing such facilities. And what we've learned is that the cost for developing them is likely going to be more than what we had anticipated when preparing the Park District one-pagers. So the analysis performed by the consultants in the study is requiring us to update the deliverables we'll be able to commit to with the level of funding recommended by all of you, the Board of Park and Recreation Commissioners, as part of the Park District recommendation. So given what we've learned, we now believe that we can probably provide one set of dedicated pickleball courts with lights, with the assistance of grants for that amount. But I think as we work towards identifying the kind of making a final recommendation on site and digging a little bit deeper, we'll be able to provide a better sense. So while this has given us a really solid start towards developing some dedicated pickleball facilities, there's a fair amount more work to be done in terms of site selection, which will also, inform the cost and timeline. So that gets me to the next steps. I think one of the critical pieces that we have to do next is a racial equity toolkit. Now that we've kind of gotten down to a shorter list of sites that we think will work really well. I think we have to pause and really evaluate, the impacts of both the recommendations for potential dual striping as well as the dedicated courts on historically marginalized community and communities of color. We are going to be doing some dual striping, this year to continue to expand capacity. The three sites that we'll be adding pickleball lines to are Gilman Playground, Alki Playground, and then Rainier Beach Playfield. And then the number of courts that will be added is shown in parentheses there. And then the other piece that we're going to be, kind of working on in this next phase is going to be local engagement around those potential dedicated sites and further investigation. So with that, I might see if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Oliver. I'll open the floor to my colleagues. Anyone in the room have any questions? I know you do.
So Oliver, thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering, one of the things that we have talked about as a board is that the department look for opportunities for partnerships, for working alongside other departments. And I'm just wondering if this survey and the study, if you looked at other landowners, other providers that might also be meeting some of the community's needs or have potential to meet more of the community needs, thinking about schools and universities or, private tennis or private pickleball providers?
Yeah, we have talked to schools, Seattle Public Schools a little bit, and I think that it sounds like it's likely that they would start lining some of the courts at their facilities as well. I know that there's an interest for a lot of their gym teachers to be able to provide pickleball as an activity, especially outside. We have talked to a few private folks as well. I think one of their biggest constraints is, and they've actually, there have been a number of kind of private folks that have come to us, and I think one of their largest constraints is finding the space and the land for this development. But I think there are a lot of private tennis clubs that are looking to expand their opportunities for pickleball too. We did look at a few locations that would be on SPU or Seattle City Light or FAS property, but a lot of them, the available open space just wasn't quite large enough to kind of meet the minimum size that we were looking for. For the dedicated sites, we're trying to find places where we can support at least 8 pickleball courts, which kind of narrows it down. But
I think I'm remembering that, was it like summer rec in the street? So there was one of the programs that was doing pop-ups, and they would set up temporary pickleball and park like empty parking lots and things like that.
Yeah. I think we have done that as well. And I think that's one of the parking lots I feel like are potentially one of the really appealing. That's one of the really appealing aspects of the Magnuson option, right? Is you're kind of converting a parking lot that doesn't get a whole lot of use into a paved surface that people can actually recreate on.
Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. Amy.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver, for the presentation, and thanks to everybody who came today. I also try to play pickleball. I'm not masteries in the time, but it's really fun. I really appreciate all the enthusiasm for it. I also really appreciate the dual striping. So wherever there might be 2 uses, that seems like a really good thing because it's not just a single use. And I think over the years, we've definitely seen tennis courts not used many times in many places. So to be able to have both, I think makes a lot of sense. So I really appreciate that. The city has done a really nice job of those sites. I have thought about a dedicated pickleball or a new pickleball location, and I wonder if that's if those can ever be chosen where there are multiple goals to be accomplished. And I'm thinking of Woodland Park, Upper Woodland Park, not where the tennis courts are. But as you know, that park got a lot of non-park use for the last 2 years, and it really, really needs some activation and needs people to spend time in it. And thanks to the Parks Department and thanks to Google, the Upper Woodland forested area is looking really good. Like you have invested a lot in that park. So even though the cost and the challenge of putting an actual something to activate the space, which could be a dedicated pickleball court, I think you paid more than that cost in cleanup. So maybe there's a parking lot, or maybe there's a place by the lawn bowling or the horseshoes, which I'm not sure how much use horseshoes gets anymore. I don't know. But that's kind of a flat area, and it's not utilized very much. I don't think it would cut off the cross-country course, which is another really important, the cross-country and school running teams use the course a lot, so we wouldn't want to change anything there. But I just think if there's a dual purpose, there might be sites like that. And I would suggest Upper Woodland Park as one of them. So, yeah.
Thank you, Amy. Davon?
No, I wasn't saying anything, but you called on me. I just want to quickly say I actually went to undergrad in Santa Cruz, so this is a park I frequented actually pretty often undergrad, and so it had a really well use and really well attraction in the community. So it felt really full circle to have you all kind of bring this as an example. I was like, oh, I actually recognize what this is, right? So I'm just very much a full supporter of kind of the suggestions that y'all are bringing, and I think it's really important for us to hear the community. And while y'all are doing this work for free, as everyone is, unless you're like paid worker, right? But we really appreciate the labor y'all are putting into this as well. So that you don't have to, but this is definitely the purpose of being here with all of us. So thank you, and I really appreciate Santa Cruz here. And so yeah,
Thank you, Davon. Stafford?
Oliver, do you see high volume use? I think you would at Genesee, but what about Georgetown?
At Georgetown, I think if based on what we've seen, I think if we built an 8-court dedicated facility that was lit, I think people would travel to it, especially if they knew they were going to be able to play. Yeah, I think there would probably be less direct neighborhood use, but yeah, I think it would. I think people would come. People would travel to it.
Sean, what's on your mind?
Well, COVID is on my mind. But beyond that, I'm trying to muddle through. I made it this far without it, but I tested positive the other day. Well, I guess since you called on me, I'll say I'm wondering what work is being done to anticipate some of that travel. I was specifically thinking about Georgetown Playfield, given the fact that it's right in that spot between where I believe it's where Corson and Airport Way cross, right? There's that off ramp from the highway, and I just wonder about parking impacts, and then also if there are any special considerations about the kinds of folks who will want to use the pickleball courts, and just more in that case, kind of the traffic and right-of-way implications for that.
I think that's a really good question, and that's the kind of details that we're going to be looking into as we dig a little bit deeper. So yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Hope you get better soon. Pasquale, any thoughts?
So really appreciative of the work done on the presentation. It was really thorough and thoughtful.
I agree. Thank you, Pasquale. So I believe now it's my turn to get on the soapbox. Question for you, Oliver. I know we talked a little bit about Magnuson in the parking lot, but just remind me, confirm my thoughts. Is the quality of construction of is the grade of construction of the asphalt concrete the same as tennis courts if we were to build a brand new pickleball court? Because I think that's a big question of how much we have to spend, right?
Yeah. And so right now, I think in the study that the landscape architect put together for us, they assumed that we would have to demolish a good portion of the existing parking lot and then replace it with, I believe, tension concrete, because I think it is quite soft there. But and that's kind of again part of the more detailed evaluation that we would have to do in the next phase, is to see whether or not, there could be a solution that would involve more like a really like detailed overlay instead. But yeah, it very well might not. And I think that the soils out there at Magnuson are pretty organic and soft too. So
It's a swamp out there.
Yeah.
Thanks. And then just another procedural thing. This discussion you're seeking, obviously not tonight, you're seeking a motion, but is that something you'd like to see from us in some sort of shape or form?
So we didn't really come here for a decision as much as an update, but you could always say, hey, you support the direction, by way of chance to do that.
Yeah, I think we definitely do, because I love adding more use to our facilities, getting more people, serving the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. And with equity, sustainability, arts, and culture, it just all fits in. It seems like a slam dunk. I'd also like to point out too that another sport was invented on a tennis court in our city, and it's bike polo. Sorry, I mentioned it, right? But yeah, loving it. Thank you so much, Oliver. Really appreciate your work.
thank you.